let's make a start. So I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Professor Mutsuhiko Yukioka from the University of Tokyo, who is speaking to us on the evolving landscape of corporate takeovers in Japan. Good luck. I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes and 2 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mutsuhiko Yukioka from the University of Tokyo in Japan. And this is my first time to participate in the ACLF, and it is a great honor to stand before you. I would like to present my research entitled The Evolving Landscape of Corporate Takeovers in Japan. This topic is particularly timely because Japan's market for corporate control may be at a pivotal moment in which it is beginning to function effectively, perhaps for the first time in the post-war period. Until recently, Japan's market for corporate control remained underdeveloped, if not dysfunctional. Hostile takeovers were exceptionally rare, and friendly deals, including management buyouts, were often executed without competing bids. However, over the past few years, this landscape has begun to change significantly. Unsolicited takeover bids are no longer unusual, and competing bids have become more common in friendly deals. I aim to describe the change in the landscape and analyze the underlying tectonic shifts behind these developments. To understand the current situation, it is useful to look back at the first decade of the century, a period of failed ambition. The early 2000s saw a notable surge in acquisition activity driven largely by the emergence of activist funds and foreign investors. Yet, the overwhelming majority of these attempts ended in failure, reinforcing the perception that Japan was a jurisdiction inhospitable to hostile takeovers. During the same period, friendly transactions, including MBOs, also became more common. The proliferation of MBOs raised a concern about the structural conflicts of interest inherent in such deals. Put simply, managers find themselves in a position where they have an incentive to complete the transaction on terms favorable to themselves. In response to growing concerns over such conflicts, the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, the MITI, issued its MBO guidelines setting out best practices to mitigate such concerns. Specifically, the guidelines recommended the following. First, boards were encouraged to seek advice from special committees independent from managerial influence. And second, boards were encouraged to secure post-signing market checks by allowing rooms for competing bids. With regard to the latter one, the post-signing market checks, given the lack of competing bids, it was unclear whether they were actually functioning effectively as a mechanism for price discovery. Since around 2020, we have witnessed a sea change. Unsolicited takeover proposals have become increasingly feasible and, in some cases, successful. Several cases are shown on the slides, and it is worth noting that these cases involved well-known Japanese companies on both sides of the deal. Further, bidding contests have become more common in recent years. For example, in 2025, the KKR submitted a competing bid against CVC-sponsored MBO of Mandam Corporation. And the resulting bidding competition drove the MBO deal price from approximately 2,000 yen to around 3,100 yen, which represents an increase of roughly 60%. These cases suggest that a market check is beginning to function in substantial terms in the context of friendly takeovers. Thus, since around 2020, hostile takeovers and competing bids have become a new feature of Japan's market for corporate control. This raises the question of why such a change has occurred. And interestingly, from a legal perspective, there has been no major change over this period. As my colleague Professor Goto pointed out in his 2014 article, Japanese company law has consistently granted shareholders strong legal rights. And with respect to the takeover defenses, case law developed in the 2000s established the so-called the principle of shareholders' will, under which the validity of the J pill, Japanese version of the poison pill, depends on whether it is approved by a shareholder vote. And there has been a case law development since the 2020s, but those developments of the court decisions can be seen as an extension of this principle. As Professor Hoshi aptly puts it recently, the substance of the Japanese regulation on anti-takeover measures is close to the UK model, which is characterized by its no frustration rule, rather than the US model, which allows the board to adopt just to say no defense. So from a legal perspective, there has not been any significant change in the last 20 years. And yet, since around 2020, Japan's takeover market appears to have undergone a substantial shift in practice. This raises the question, why is that the case? Why the landscape has changed in recent years? And in what follows, I will examine the underlying tectonic shifts that can explain this change. The first shift is the unwinding of cross-shareholdings. Traditionally, Japanese corporate ownership has been characterized by the so-called stable shareholders, such as banks, insurance companies, and business partners who hold shares for strategic purposes of maintaining business relationships with each other. These stable shareholders have typically prioritized those relationships and, as a result, tended to act in favor of incumbent management. However, this shareholding structure has been changing since the 1990s, and the unwinding trend appears to have accelerated recently. Several driving factors can be identified, as shown in the slides. The first is the Corporate Governance Code introduced by the Tokyo Stock Exchange in 2015. And its 2018 revision strongly signaled the TSE's expectation that companies should unwind cross-shareholdings to improve their capital efficiency. The second is the Tokyo's TSE's market reforms in 2022. As part of this reform, the TSE introduced the so-called tradable share ratio requirement, which has effectively pressured companies to reduce stable shareholdings in order to avoid the risk of delisting. And the third is the TSE's reiterated emphasis on the capital efficiency of listed companies. In 2023, the TSE requested that companies adopt management practices that are mindful of cost of capital and stock prices, explicitly targeting firms with a book-to-price ratio below 1. In this context, cross-shareholdings are typically viewed as a source of capital inefficiency, making it more difficult for companies to justify maintaining such holdings. Second shift is the attitude of the management. In the past, listed companies in Japan often prioritized the interests of the corporate community, particularly employees, over shareholder value. However, following the collapse of the asset price bubble around 1990 and the subsequent lost decades, there has been a growing recognition that this Japanese-style corporate governance model was not effective in delivering capital efficiency and sustainable growth. Against this backdrop, the Abe administration placed a corporate governance reform at the center of its Japan revitalization strategy. And the corporate governance goal that I mentioned earlier was part of this broader policy agenda. And in the context of the corporate takeovers, an important recent development is the guidelines for corporate takeovers published by the MITI in 2023. These guidelines are based on the idea that takeovers that contribute to corporate value and shareholders' interests should be encouraged because they can improve resource allocation and facilitate industrial restructuring and renewal. On this basis, they called on listed companies to engage in sincere consideration to a bona fide acquisition offer. An equally important development can be seen among domestic institutional investors. In the past, they often supported management, considering their business relationships with investee companies. In recent years, however, their voting behavior has become more stringent. And this shift is partly due to the stewardship code introduced by the Financial Services Agency, FSA, in 2014. In particular, after its 2017 revision, which requires the disclosure of individual voting decisions, it became more difficult for institutional investors to behave in a way that is overly accommodating to incumbent management. As a result, even when management seeks to adopt a JPU in response to a hostile takeover, it has become increasingly uncertain whether such measures would obtain shareholders' approval. Furthermore, the public perception of hostile takeovers also appears to be changing. Unlike in the past, it appears that hostile takeovers are no longer a taboo. This changing perception may have been reinforced by the emergence of cases in which leading Japanese companies have engaged in unsolicited takeovers, as discussed earlier. Alongside this, there are also signs of change in the attitudes of financial institutions that support takeover transactions. In the past, for example, securities firms were generally reluctant to advise hostile bidders out of concern for reputational harms and the possible loss of business opportunities. In recent years, however, such a stance appears to be gradually weakening. And these developments suggest that market participants are increasingly accepting the view that unsolicited takeover proposals should not be regarded with hostility, as long as they are made in good faith with the aim of enhancing the target's corporate value. So to wrap up, the landscape of the corporate takeovers in Japan has changed dramatically in recent years. However, this transformation has not been driven by any changes in the legal framework. In fact, the legal regime has remained largely stable for the last 20 years. In other words, shareholders have consistently enjoyed strong legal rights, and takeover defenses have been governed by the principle of the shareholders' will. At the same time, however, this legal regime did not translate into a robust market for corporate control in practice throughout the 2010s. The recent change of the landscape can be understood as the result of several tectonic shifts beneath the legal regime that I discussed. This is the last slide. So the implications to be drawn from the Japan's experience as follows. In Japan, the legal regime favorable to hostile takeovers began to function effectively only when it was accompanied by the changes in shareholder composition and market norms. In other words, shareholder primacy as a legal principle does not in itself translate into practice. For example, where the shareholder base is dominated by stable shareholders, shareholder decision-making is likely to ratify the position of the incumbent management. For this reason, shareholder composition is of central importance. At the same time, shareholder composition alone is not sufficient to explain the whole picture. In Japan, changes in the behavior of domestic institutional investors also played a critical role. This is because such investors have faced conflicts of interest, particularly the incentive to maintain business relationships with the investee companies. A key catalyst for addressing this problem was Japan's stewardship code formulated by the FSA. In addition, and changes in managerial attitudes driven by the Tokyo Stock Exchange and the broader government policy also appears to have been important. So overall, the Japanese experience suggests that the robustness of the market for corporate control depends not only on the legal framework, but also the surrounding market norms and the institutional environment. In other words, the functioning of takeover markets depends on the interaction between the legal framework and the underlying governance ecosystem, including shareholder composition, institutional investor behavior, and market expectations. Law, in this sense, operates not in isolation, but as part of broader institutional settings. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, well done. And beautiful keeping to time. I'm very pleased to introduce now Nydia Remolina Leon, who is from Singapore Management University, to comment on the paper. Thank you, Nydia.
Thank you very much. So I think I have some slides. Let me check where they are.
Oh, you're so prepared. And they're very beautiful too.
Thank you. So where's the clicker? So thank you so much to Mutsuhiko for the fantastic paper. I really enjoyed reading the paper because it provides us an overview of this evolution of takeovers in Japan, which is quite unique. So I think the paper has a lot of positive points and a great contribution to a story that is not usually highlighted, not as often in the literature. So I really liked that about the paper. My comments, I will go rapidly to the comments since we have limited time. I will start by the last part of the paper, by commenting on the last part, on when you talk about the tension that you find the current framework of takeovers in Japan. So you mentioned here that there is this tension that is already treated in the literature on price versus corporate value. But the point here, I think it could be even enhanced. I know this is a draft and this is the policy part of the paper and the implications for the Japanese case. And I think something very useful for the takeover literature here would be to highlight what of these features that we find that are unique in Japan could help explain in the scholarship that what exactly within those tectonic or these underlying reasons for the evolution of Japanese takeovers, what of those could help explain the tension more easily, or what of those tectonic shifts or changes could help us explain when the tension is increased or when it is more solved. So that link between the evolution that you're telling us, between that conclusion and policy, policy implication, I think that could be enhanced in the last part of the paper. My other comments are on each one of these underlying reasons of the evolution. So why does the Japanese takeover framework change over time? So you gave 3 or 4 of these tectonic reasons or shifts that you could find in the evolution of Japan. So the first one that you mentioned is the changes in corporate ownership structure in Japan. My recommendation here would be to maybe separate the different types of changes in ownership structure that you found in Japan, because you talk about different things, but it could be easy for the reader to understand it in separate ways. So ownership concentration on the one hand, the proportion of management-friendly, stable, or strategic holdings on the other hand, and how does that change? Fourthly, the level of institutional ownership, domestic and foreign, how does that change in Japan, and provide data on that? And finally, the free float and market liquidity. And something that you could use besides the cases that you are pointing out when you describe the evolution for this particular underlying reason could be found maybe in other literature, other papers, but also I highly recommend this report by the OECD. As I know this is not meant to be an empirical study, so I'm not saying that you should maybe develop an empirical model or data that shows each one of these items, but the OECD report of capital markets in Asia gives you an overview of how does this change in different countries in the region, including Japan. So, for example, I listed here, I'm not going to go into the details of each one of these data points, but for example, there is a clear evolution on how institutional investors are investing in Japanese companies, in equity particularly. So that will help you enhance this message that on why shareholder voting became more meaningful constraint on boards in Japan. And there are other data points that I'm putting out here in these comments. Of course, you will have the slides later on that could help you enhance that message of why this underlying reason or tectonic shift is important for the Japanese story. The second one that you talk about is changing attitudes of the management. So my recommendation here would be to maybe separate this discussion into two type of subsections. One on the impact of the soft law mechanisms that you're talking about in the paper, and the other one, a subsection of measurable behavioral effects. So for example, payouts, buybacks, value up disclosures that have shown an impact on how managers actually perceived takeovers and the result of that. Not only anecdotal cases on that, which is actually very helpful, but also maybe explaining or fleshing out those two subsections will help us understand better this change in attitude and frame the discussion more in terms of incentives rather than attitude. At the end of the day, it could be almost the same thing, but it's just a way of framing the discussion differently in terms of more, let's say, incentives and law and economics driven. And one part here that I didn't see in the paper discussed in the soft law mechanisms where I've heard and I read in the OECD paper, in the OECD report, for example, that there is the South Korean corporate value up program. It's something that South Korean, interestingly, Japan, someone told me that Japan also implemented this. So is this part of this incentives package that we can consider to understand the change in the attitude of managers in the context of takeovers as well, and how they care about corporate value and performance of the company? The other shift that you explain in the paper is the change in the mindset of target companies and public perception on takeovers. So my comment here, it's a bit similar to the previous ones in terms of redefining maybe public perception, particularly when you cite the news that talk about how the general public has perceived these threats on the companies. It's something now good, right? That gives context to the discussion, but I would suggest to maybe flesh out the arguments more in terms of not the public perception because of the news, but how often initially unsolicited bids became recommended bids in the context of takeovers, to show that there is actually a change on that regard, and document whether major banks or securities firms, if you can find any of those cases, are now willing to advise on finance bidders in circumstances where they historically would not. Have you seen this type of change in the context of financial advisors when we talk about takeovers? That's something that will also give you hints on the change of the perception of stakeholders in takeovers. And finally, just to wrap up, the last part of the paper, which is still under development, you try to explain here and want to flesh out arguments on the implications of the paper for future research and for the scholarship in general. So here, my suggestion would be maybe to explore that this part of that you introduced in the first part on the discipline that is created by takeovers. So can you maybe find something in higher takeover premiums or more frequent bid revisions or improved post-merger performance that could indicate that actually this new shift, this evolution in takeovers in Japan has been translated into more market discipline? Are there any evidence, even if it's not empirical, something that is qualitative indicative of that? So those are my comments. I hope those are helpful. Thank you so much.